So right here, an acceptable paraphrase to what that huge chunk says up top is just basically saying a Harvard study blames external factors such as lack of education resources for first-year drop rates. We have the author, we have the year, we have the page number that all that information was still found on, even though we did shorten it up, and then we followed up with a period. That period at the end is telling the reader this is a paraphrase. So that would be an example of an accurate paraphrase or a summary. And there's not going to be one exact way how to paraphrase, there's going to be many ways. But you're going to find that as you're doing these PowerPoints, a lot of times you are going to need to paraphrase to get that information into your shortened, abbreviated PowerPoint presentation. All right. Sorry, we were addressing a question here. But before we get further on into with Dr. Marcuccelli, got a couple more slides. One of the things that you're going to work with often, we're moving away from the quotations, long, short paraphrases, and we're going to be looking at one of the common things that you're going to include inside of your APA PowerPoint presentation. That's going to be working with figures or graphics. This can be anything from funny little pictures that you found in a Google search to just kind of brighten up, make your presentation a little bit more interesting than mine has been so far. The reason I'm going to give a little caveat to that is because I wanted to wait on the pictures until we got to this actual slide, so I apologize for it being a little bit boring. It can be tables, graphs, charts. It can be something that's supporting your argument that you're trying to work with. However, if you use these, we're still going to have to cite them in most cases. However, in the first case, as we're going to see, if you use clipart. Clipart are just a stockpile of graphics that you can use. If it's just something small that you're finding, it's public domain. You don't need to cite this. If you're just using that, like this question mark here, just to kind of spruce up what the page looks like, to make it a little bit more visually appealing, you don't necessarily need to cite that. However, if you use an actual image that is credited to somebody, for example, here we have an aerial shot of the University of Minnesota Medical Campus. I use University of Minnesota because I attended there, and I just was partial. So if you don't credit this, basically you're telling the reader that you took that picture. And if I had somebody show me that picture, I'd say, that's kind of ridiculous. You don't have a helicopter. Come on. So instead, we got to give a little note underneath the picture saying, this is from somewhere else, and here's where I got it from. To do so, starting with the first figure that you do address in your presentation, you're going to want to label that as the figure 1. You're going to want to label that as the name of the picture or the image that you found it as. A lot of times you'll see when you find these images that they'll be assigned a name. If you can't find one, find a short abbreviated name that you can assign to that picture. And then if you'll see here, we have the University of Minnesota 2012, underline it. If you click on that, that'll actually bring you, I did hyperlink that to the source where I did find it from. You can do that, that's not required. You will want to have this though on a reference page. We're always going to have all the reference material at the end of a PowerPoint presentation. So that same URL site, along with the citation that you use for an image that we'll cover later on the reference page, we're going to include there inside that link. Moving on, sometimes you may resort to a table or graph. A lot of our students are nursing students, work in the medical field, so a lot of times, graph data, table data is going to be very relevant in what you're discussing. If you can ever find data like this, you can certainly use it. Make sure you're giving it credit. If we're going to continue with this pattern of assigning the figure 2 in this case, the title of this graph was named RN Certifications Graph, and we found this, I believe it was a children's hospital out of Charlotte, I do believe. If you clicked on that, I also hyperlinked that author's name and the year. I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name, but it's hyperlinked there, so if a reader wanted to see where did they get this graph from, they can follow your trail of breadcrumbs to find it. One important note though, I could almost create a presentation just on how to use tables and graphs. We don't necessarily have the time here in this webinar tonight. However, I do stress, if you are going to be using these, whether it's in manuscripts, your written assignments, or if you're going to be using them in PowerPoints, do refer to Chapter 5 in your APA style guide, because it does give you different information on how you can elaborate, create notes on data or charts that they're looking at, also how to, all the proper citations for different situations you may encounter. It's a little bit more in-depth, so we don't necessarily need to worry about that now, but if you do want to find that, if you get to that point, Chapter 5 in the 6th edition guide. The last thing that we did want to touch on here before I hand it over to Dr. Marcuccelli is personal communication. A lot of the times students are going to be conducting interviews, keeping up with the citations of images. We'll see down the bottom right we have a mock interview going on. That was the name of the image, so we include it here. But just because this is used a lot, and that's why I highlighted interviews here, there are certain ways on how we can cite personal communication, such as interviews inside of manuscripts and PowerPoint presentations alike. This is information on how to do these citations taken from the American Sentinel Writing Center itself. I did use the proper citation techniques I've been talking about because it seemed to be a little hypocritical of me if I didn't do so. So we'll see here that when citing personal communication, we're still going to use author date method instead of the author's name, using the person that you were interviewing. And you're going to also see one little added feature is that when you include the name after it, you're going to include the note, personal communication. That's signifying to the reader that this took place in an interview or an email or whatever it may have been. One note to make on this, though, is that personal communication cannot be necessarily tracked down unless you're recording all of them or you're keeping transcripts, which most people don't do. But it did happen. You do have this information, so you wrote it down on a notebook and you want to use it. You can still use it, but you can use an in-text citation using how we just showed here. However, on a reference page, you're not going to be using that just because there's no way for the reader to actually track that information down. Just so you know that, and you can see that again in the Writing Center or in the APA 6th edition guide.